fit.
So what are some of the areas that you're looking to see the executive implement by itself?
Yeah, I think one of the problems that we have in Nigeria, if I could just take a step back before I get to that question, is that we haven't really embraced participatory democracy. People know that there's a report out there, and people know that the national conference has ended. There's a high degree of cynicism and apathy, and I appreciate it. So some of us are trying to, particularly the Lagos delegation, we're trying to condense it, summarize it, and make it appreciable to Nigerians.
The entire recommendation?
Yes, there's 600 recommendations. I mean, who's going to troll through 10,000 pages of documents? Those of us who even have access to the report. But to break it down into 1 page, 2 pages, that the average Nigerian can look in the newspaper and say, this is what the National Conference said. And in looking at those recommendations, you will then see the things that the federal government doesn't have to wait for the National Assembly to do, and can't even excuse not doing it before this election or this term ends. And I say things like the policy on youth and young adults. Some of us argued that there should be, the way we have gender quota, the way we have an emphasis on gender employment and gender positioning, there should be a youth quota. There should be a deliberate policy towards making sure that inexperienced, qualified but inexperienced people who've just come out of school should be given an opportunity. Because as far as the youths are concerned, there's an emergency in Nigeria today. I mean, where you have 60% of your national population are under the age of 30, and 70% or 60% of that population are unemployed. So we didn't get that through, but there's an affirmative action policy in the recommendation that there's a 30% affirmative. That's a step. You don't need the federal, the national executive, the National Assembly to do that. The presidency can immediately make that in the public sector to start with a national policy that when you're taking people, if you can employ 18 to 30-year-old people who are typically the youth and young adults, have complied with this policy. In the private sector, you can even give tax incentives. The way you give pioneer status to people who start new businesses. You can give tax incentives to companies who are seen to fill their quota of youth employment. So there's that.
Do you know why I'm smiling? I'm smiling because I see a lot of people reducing their ages to, I mean, we're already getting to see some of those things. But what hurdles do you see? Because we do know that a large part of it will also be, especially the constitutional part of it, will be implemented by the National Assembly. And that's where a lot of people, you know, have their concerns because they don't think that the National Assembly is just going to rubber stamp what it is that has been debated. They most likely will pass it through their own processes as well. Do you see the report scaling through that process?
Well, I don't see all the recommendations scaling through, but I think it's a good opportunity for even the National Assembly to see what the ideas out there that have achieved some sort of consensus, if you like. Everybody has mini debates in their homes, in their gatherings, in whatever groups that we have, but to have a formal report, you know, in public service, policy reporting is a very important thing. If you ignore the opportunity to put your ideas down in a report, you do so at your peril, which is why it was important that this conference happened, and it was important that we got the report done. For this gathering, this interview, in public service, if this isn't documented, it didn't happen. It's just that simple. If I could argue myself blue in the face to say, I had a meeting when the 4 of you, 3 of you, blah, blah, blah. If it's not, there's no minute of it, there's no report of it, it didn't happen. So that's the importance of reports. In taking the recommendations to the National Assembly, at least they will see that there is a suggestion that Nigerians want a smaller, exclusive legislative list, for instance. We were able to reduce the legislative list from 68 items to 58. I think it's still too big, but that was what the conference was able to come up with. That way, it is clear that Nigerians have said the federal government is too centralized. It has taken too much power. Power should be devolved to the states. So in things like that, I think the National Assembly will be very well served to look at the report critically. If I was a chairman of a committee of the Senate or a committee of the House, and had that report, I'll troll through it to see the subjects that relate to my chairmanship. And I'll put it to my committee members. Look, let's take a closer look at these issues. It's not...
Well, speak to us about this perception that people had about some of the recommendations, rightly or wrongly though, the perceptions that it looked at though, while those discussions went on, that the delegates didn't want some of those recommendations to go for ratification through the National Assembly. Was that correct?
No, I don't think so. I think there was a general attempt in some quarters to pitch the conference against the National Assembly as if there was some sort of competition for power. The suggestion of a referendum and going straight to the public was quite there right from the beginning. But it has its own constitutional problems because that's yet to be included in our constitution. So that couldn't be the route to go through. So it still had to be that route of either going to the National Assembly or...
Okay, well, what was the idea behind, because I see in some of those recommendations that you approved that states would draft their own constitution while they also get state police?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a feature of federalism that we've not practiced that species of federalism in this country. And it somewhat might be a surprise to many adults that the sovereignty of constituent subnationals in a country like Nigeria is not to be trifled with. It is the basis upon which this country is created. To recognize that Nigeria wasn't created by, that the states wasn't created by Nigeria. It was the states that created Nigeria. The states came together to create Nigeria. The federal government didn't decide to create the states. And therefore, if you get that principle, you would realize that there is a sovereignty that the states have. And to decide on their own constitution, internal, subnational constitution, is something that existed even in the regional arrangements we had between 1958 and 1963. It's what exists in the federal government of the United States, in Germany, and other countries that practice federalism. So that principle is sacrosanct. I mean, I agree with that. The other point you made about state police, again, that's a feature of devolution of central power to the subnationals. Policing is a local thing. Policing is a community thing, in fact. We've lost a lot of policing resources by over-centralizing it. Intelligence is even down to streets and neighborhoods, not centrally controlled from seats of government 5,000 kilometers, 500 kilometers away. So, yeah, that's a very important feature, and I was happy that made its way through.
But do you see this sailing through? Because, I mean, politics seems to overshadow some of these ideas, as lofty as they may seem.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant point. The point I made about national policy reporting, or policy reporting in government circles, in the public sector, is very important. You see, if this term of the National Assembly or the next term of the National Assembly don't pass the recommendations in this report, it's not wasted. Policy reporting in government circles creates a precedent, creates a resource for future governments to refer to. You know, today there's a reference to geopolitical zones. You know, we all use it. We use it to describe ourselves. We use it to plan. We use it to choose even the national football team. And I know you're a sports lover. But there is no provision for geopolitical zones in our Constitution. There is no statute that creates geopolitical zones. It was the view of a section of the National Constitutional Conference under Abacha's regime in 1995. And that's where that phrase entered our political lexicon. So it's creeping, and don't be surprised one day if that phrase gets into the Constitution, even though when it arose in this conference, we shut it down. And we favored sticking to states as we know it. There's an argument that the geopolitical zones should become regions and they should federate. The 6 geopolitical zones will be the subdivisions of this country. And we resisted that. The conference resisted it, and I'm happy about that.
Why?
Because I don't think it's workable. Speaking from a Lagos State point of view, it doesn't work for us because when they created 6 political zones, they didn't seem to realize that Lagos should be a political zone. which I think is an oversight. To say that is to ignore the history of this country, because this country was created by 3 subdivisions joining together, not 2. In 1906, the colony of Lagos was joined with the Niger Coast Protectorate and the Niger Territories in the north. It was that amalgamation that created the amalgamation in 1914. So those were the 3 subdivisions that this country was made up of at that time. So to now create 6 geopolitical zones, and somehow somebody doesn't see that Lagos is geographical or political enough to be a zone. So for that reasons and others, and I confess my bias, for that reason and others, I don't think geopolitical zones is workable. Particularly now, particularly now that people are clamoring for more states.